Welcome to the Pacific Region Forum on Business and Management Communication. I'm Rosalie Tong, Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Garry Bruton, who is a Professor of Entrepreneurship and holder of the Fehmi Zeko Faculty Fellowship at the Neeley School of Business at Texas Christian University. Professor Bruton is a prolific author and has published over 75 academic articles and many books. His research is in the area of entrepreneurship in emerging economies. The title of his talk today is Entrepreneurship and China. Professor Bruton's presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. Without much ado, I'll turn the talk to Garry.
Be here, you know, it's Vancouver's wonderful. I know the weather is always this nice, you know, and that I can go back to Texas and say, you know, Vancouver is the new promised land. It's only 75 degrees, always sunny. So I do appreciate it. Rosalie's a very old friend, a very dear friend, has always been so gracious and so helpful to me. And so really quite honored to be here at the university. What this is probably more, it's more designed for a practitioner audience. It has some facts and figures in it, but it's not based on research as much as more observing what goes on in China over a number of years. You know, I have been studying entrepreneurship in China for 17, 18, 19 years. I guess we sort of hate to think of how many years. But I know a number of you are really very much China experts, and so we'll probably hopefully have some good discussion about, you may see things differently, and that's a good point too. And if I had sort of a summary of where we're going to try to get to today, is that as I look at China, I really think what we see is a policy success story, not an entrepreneurship success story. And I think ultimately where China has to move, though, for the future is to entrepreneurship. Particularly if they're going to avoid the middle income trap, they're going to have to start creating more high value added ventures. And so that's really going to come through entrepreneurship. And so in many ways, when I look at China, I think of the changes over the next 20 years being as great as what we've seen over the last 30 years. Because we're really looking at a change in how the economy is going to have to move forward. But that's where, as you move up that value chain, that's what's going to have to happen. And so I do believe entrepreneurship is critical. And as we think about this, again, I will always put the caveat in there that China is a big country, 1.3 billion people. There's always exceptions, and this is sort of some gross generalizations about a country that's very diverse, and provinces difference, and you can always find an example that says, well, but so these are sort of more broad generalizations about what I see when I look there. You know, and again, the classic story is, as we think about China, you know, it's clearly a dramatic success story. You know, you can't deny that China is one of the great successes, economic successes, you know, over the last 20 years. You know, as we start looking at the GDP per capita, clearly has gone up. This is also at the relative income level. I do think it's important that we always still remember, I find particularly for those audiences, not like this one, that are not as familiar with China, you know, people show up in Shanghai and they think, well, this is what China looks like, or they see the Beijing Olympics and they think, oh my God, you know, it's an OECD country. You know, China is still an emerging economy. It is still many areas of poverty. We often forget about the 300 million people that still live on $1.25 a day. There's still regions, and so as we look at this relative income level, important to keep that in mind, but you can't deny that China is a significant growth pattern that has occurred. You know, as we think about the macro level, I'm always impressed that the share of global imports has continued to expand despite the increases in expenses that have gone up. You know, the exports continue to grow significantly. The terms of trade are deteriorating, but China still continues to expand. So its costs are going up. But it's continued to expand quite significantly over the last 20 years. That it's quite impressive. We look at the level of exports and imports. I do think always it's important too, as we think about China, to remember that there are significant imports. We, particularly in the United States, we tend to talk about, that we're importing too much from China. Oh my gosh, they're taking over the world, but we tend to forget that we're also selling an awful lot to China. The world does, and they buy an awful lot of stuff. But you can't deny, again, that the level of imports or the level of exports that are coming from China are quite significant and dramatic over the period of time. So when we think about China, I think it is appropriate. People have said that it's one of the largest transformations in the history of the world since the Industrial Revolution. And so, we think about the rise of the United Kingdom, the rise of the U.S. and Germany, the Japanese, and now it's really the China. And so we can't deny that. And so as we look at this and when we think about entrepreneurship, we clearly have a success story that we're trying to look at as we consider China. And again, as we think about the economy, and if we take it in consideration as at looking at the prices of things, again, China clearly the second largest economy in the world, so very significant activity. So one of the things, though, that where I start to deviate, where a lot of people think, though, is they tend to give the credit to entrepreneurship. And so there was a recent issue of The Economist, and they talk about China as this entrepreneurial success story. And that's really where I start to deviate with them. And so some of the things statistics that you will see is 70% of the GDP is produced by firms that are not majority state-owned. 75% of the profits from firms not majority state-owned. One of the issues that I have there is that when we start thinking about China, most of the firms have very complex ownership structures. And I think it's a very poor measure to say a firm is not majority state-owned. Really the issue for Chinese firms is state-influenced or state-controlled. So you have a number of companies that still have minority state interest or state influence that control their activities. And so I think it's really a mistake when we start trying to say that the state is not still the predominant influence in the economy of China. And so I don't think you can deny that the state is one of the critical issues that really decides economically what happens in China. That does not mean that things have not been privatized to some degree. It does not mean that firms are not listed, even though they will have elements of that listing still owned by the state. The state, though, fundamentally is still in control. And actually, my personal observation is that the state is becoming more influential, not less influential. Particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, I think the state has reasserted itself. It made people very nervous of if this could happen to the U.S. economy, one of the world's largest, where do we want to move with privatization? So I think instead what we need to be thinking about is that the role of the state in the economy is still the predominant influence as we look forward. And so I think when people look at things as something not majority owned and try to make indications that this means that China now has moved to an entrepreneurial environment, I think that they have made a mistake. When we look at some of the largest firms by revenues, again, when we start thinking about them, China, largest firms by revenue, 46 of them are listed as from China in 2010, but almost all of those are state-owned enterprises. So again, an indication of the role of the state as we move forward. As we start thinking about private firms, what we start seeing, and we have some statistics here in a minute about the actual employment numbers of those, most of the private firms are small. And again, when we end up, I think we end up with a bias in our analysis of China. It's a little bit like, I think Americans do the same thing, and I apologize for an American example, but I am one. So Americans tend to think everything in the world is coming from China. Why? They go to Walmart and they walk into the store and everything they see is from China. But the truth is that's just what they personally buy themselves. It's not looking at the equipment. It's not looking at lots of automobiles or all of these other things. It's the things that they see. So when we're in Shanghai or we're in Beijing, we tend to go down the street and we see a private little restaurant. We see a private little stationery store and this little store and that little store. One of the things to keep in mind as we think about entrepreneurship, again, the very active in sort of the entrepreneurship field, but many times we will not consider a small business an entrepreneurial business. It's a lifestyle business. So most of these are lifestyle businesses. They're not ventures created to create value for the society. They're basically providing the income for this individual versus a job. So they tend to produce lots of employment, but they don't produce lots of impact on your economy. And so what we tend to see there is these small firms, and so we tend to allocate, well, the rest of the world is privatizing. Well, it's not really the case. And what I argue is that China, when we look at it, is a policy story. It's not an entrepreneurial story. And one of the things, even as we look here in a minute, as we think about India, one of the things that you have to give China credit for is that the government works. India, one of the phrases that you'll often hear is you never file a lawsuit for yourself. You file it for your grandchildren. Why? Because India's going to take forever. The government doesn't really work all that well in India. When you look at China, the government makes decisions, they implement them, they achieve them. Now that can also be a double-edged sword that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but when you look at where they've been able to move the country, it's a policy story, it's not an entrepreneurship story. So as you start thinking about the size of employment, when we look at the private enterprises, we actually see that the number of employees is declining over recent years. Why? Because we're getting a whole lot more of them, but they're much smaller. And so we're seeing the numbers expand, but they're being very, very small. We have relatively few large firms that are private enterprises. And again, when we start thinking about out of 5.5 million private enterprises, there's fewer than 500,000 that will have over 500 employees. What we have is a flood of lots and lots of small businesses. We're not getting these large businesses that are private and that are developing things. The interesting comparison is if you compare this to Korea or Japan or Taiwan at sort of similar periods of time and development, you would find significant private firms that were getting large. That's one of the things as you start thinking about China, we start thinking about, well, what are the big private companies? And it's always one of those great things that you ask in a classroom. You say, tell me a private Chinese company. Most students can't think of any Chinese companies that they can give you a name of. The only one may be Huawei, but beyond that, it's really difficult for them to come up with. If we start thinking back, and we're sort of extrapolating back, but at a similar point in time, we would have, and if we'd asked in our classrooms, they would have already been able to say Toyota or Sony, or it would have been Lucky Gold at that stage, not LG. But there would have been companies that would have been big and successful and the world would have already known at a similar point in time for Japan and Korea and other countries. So we're not seeing these big companies, that private companies develop out of China. Instead, we're getting these lots and lots of small companies. So when we look at the private sector, lots of small companies. In aggregate, they build up. They have particularly lots of employment, but the value output is not necessarily that great. And so when I look as an entrepreneurship scholar, what you see is this policy story. You're not seeing it's an entrepreneurship story that's developing out of it. You do have to give credit, if at Ningbo and some other areas, there are lots of private firms that are very successful. And so again, we're making a gross generalization, but when we look on a whole for China, we're not seeing this entrepreneurship develop at the level that we would like to, that at least I personally think it needs to do. Some of the reasons when we look at this is, China's relatively ease of business is not an easy place to do business as an entrepreneur. Particularly the regulations and a number of things are very difficult for entrepreneurs to do business, is one of the reasons why it occurs. I think that the environment, and again, let's think about, you live in Vancouver. Why are there so many Chinese entrepreneurs in Vancouver? Why do they come here? The reality is it signifies something at home when you have this capital outflow and human outflow. And even if they are going back and forth, it's not that their total focus is on China. Why? Because it shows a harsh environment back at home, one of high risk. You know, one of the things that we see, you know, when we look at investment in China, you know, and again, this is always one of those great examples. You know, China invests more in the British Virgin Islands than in the UK. You know, well, why? It's round-trip money. People are trying to get their money out of China, then they try to bring it back. Why? Because then it's international money and it's protected differently. And historically, there was a difference in tax policy, but really it's now more the protection issues. You know, why do people do that? Why do people go through the hassles? Well, it's because of the potentially harsh environment that exists. You know, and so I think as we think about entrepreneurship, we've got to appreciate the environment. When we have an IPO relative to the rest of the world, the founders sell out relatively quickly. Why? Because they want to get money off the table. They want to take some of that money to Vancouver or Sydney or you know, into Auckland and New Zealand. They're trying to find how do we lower our risk. And that in itself is a huge indicator of what the environment is for entrepreneurs in China today. Still very much a high risk money. You know, when we think about the work environment for entrepreneurs, you know, there is high risk capital that is available. But it's, again, we tend to label everything in China as venture capital, even when the truth is in a place like the United States or Canada, we would label an awful lot of it as private equity. Private equity being more mature firms and buyouts, mezzanine type of financing. The relative environment for high risk, high return type of venture capital financing is relatively limited. And so it all gets classified as venture capital. Why? Because it's much sexier to call it venture capital than it is to call it private equity, particularly when Germans and some others call those locust. So they don't want to identify it that way, so people call it venture capital. But the truth, if you look at the nature of the investments, is not necessarily the same as what happens in Silicon Valley. When we think about those people willing to work for startups, and again, if you're around Chinese universities, what you find are everyone wants to go work for, you know, an international company, an SOE, to go home and say, I have come to the university, I've been at Fudan, I've been at Nankai, I've been at different universities, but I'm going to go start my venture. You know, your parents would be appalled. You know, why? Because you need to go get a job. The culture is not one that rewards. And again, compare that to the United States and Canada. You know, when our students come to us and say, we're going to go start a venture, most of the time it's like, great, go do it. Now's the time to go do it. There are not the number of individuals who want to start the startups, who take that risk, who then necessarily then either or want to work for one of those startups. And so it's difficult to actually find the best people to go form the startups in China. Some of that's cultural. You know, the difficulty in acquiring, focus on brands sort of limits what you can do with early customers. Exit options, again, we don't really have a market to list in the same way that we have in the United States, Canada, or Europe. The social valuation, again, of entrepreneurs is just different. You know, it's not typically that same sort of perception. When I'm dealing with Chinese students, I find they typically, you can ask them if they want to be an entrepreneur, and they say yes, but then do they really understand what they're doing? And you see the same thing. It's interesting to me, particularly when I deal with entrepreneurs older, more my age than some of our younger colleagues here, you know, and you say, are your children want to take over the factory? And a lot of times they don't want those dirty old jobs. You know, they don't want to work in the dirty old factory. You know, they're looking to do something else that's much sexier and nicer, you know, and in a lot of ways, I think the transition in the future, when we do have these successful OEMs, et cetera, is going to be real interesting in the future. So what do we have? You know, and again, we think about entrepreneurship in China, a lot of the things that we look at. Chinese entrepreneurs on the whole are also unwilling to give up control. You know, the issue of having the title and actually controlling the firm. Again, this has been a barrier to what we see with entrepreneurship in China. You know, in the US or Canada, if I took one of your students and said, it's your idea, but I'm going to take it from you, but I'm going to make you rich, most of them would say, great, you know, I'm happy being rich, just go do it. China, it's a very different approach. The Chinese will want control of that entity. They will not give up. What that limits is the nature of the investment that you're going to get. Because you can end up with very bright young people who have great ideas, but they don't know how to run a business. They don't have the proper connections. And so what you want to do is basically say, let me take that idea and run with it. We'll make the investment for you. I'm going to make you rich, but they won't give up that level of control. And so what you end up with is equity. Single entrepreneurs basically typically are really dependent upon themselves. Again, this limitation of capital I think is a critical issue. The short-term time horizons, again, that's one of the things, I know Hofstede has talked here before, but I do believe that is one of the things they got wrong. I don't find Chinese entrepreneurs have a long-term horizon. It's a very short-term horizon on how do we get things done and how do we make our money and how do we move on to the next thing. But in of itself becomes a limitation to the entrepreneurship that's happening. When we look at where they've had success, it's basically in low-cost manufacturing. But again, when we think about entrepreneurship, it's ultimately going to be moving to these high-value added types of activities. And that's when we talk about entrepreneurship. And again, if I can, for those of you that maybe are not as much into entrepreneurship, when we talk about entrepreneurship, we're not talking about mom and pop opening a little restaurant. We're talking about creating value. I look at entrepreneurship around the world, and one of the measures that we even use when we're looking at settings of poverty is, do you hire anybody outside the family? When you start creating value, you start hiring others, when you can start generating that multiplier effect, that's really when you start changing a society. And so that's where, and particularly when we think about high technology entrepreneurship has been very challenged in China. And again, some of the reasons: protection of intellectual property, financing, education barriers. Again, this is a very hierarchical system. Where you graduated, who you know, all of those things come in, but they're barriers to limitations. If we start thinking again to the people, some of the entrepreneurs that we know in the United States, from Bill Gates, Stephen Jobs, Mark Cuban, these are guys who none of them graduated from college. In an environment like China, they may have been brilliant, but they wouldn't have been able to make it. Why? Because they didn't have the credentials, they didn't necessarily have the relationships, they didn't have all of those activities that go in to feed entrepreneurship and really make it happen. They didn't have relationships. Again, you think about Mark Cuban is a local Dallas guy, very clever, very, very successful, but he would have met none of the requirements. He had none of the credentials, none of the relationships, from the wrong family, all of those things, poor social skills, couldn't, Stephen Jobs, didn't meet Jobs, but they sound like two sort of dysfunctional people that couldn't have met any of the criteria, but they've created so much value. They've created so many ventures that have added jobs, created jobs. Again, when we start thinking about China and sort of looking at where we're going with it, some of the barriers to entrepreneurship in China. What have we got? I think that there's low investment in R&D, particularly in indigenization. What we find is an indigenization, when we talk about that, what we're talking about is there's low spending to actually adapt things to your local needs. And so what we'll find in China is that people will buy things or they'll do investigations, but they don't necessarily adapt it to what their own needs are specifically. Why that's important, and again, it feeds into this time horizon. Why that's important is because you don't do the next generation if you don't really understand this generation. And so you're investing in things, but you're not spending to actually build the knowledge so you could build the next one yourself. And so spending to actually understand how to adapt things yourself is very low when it comes to China. When we look at again, as we start thinking about China, when we think about entrepreneurship, again, we look at some of the areas, and this is by some work by a fellow named Huang out of MIT, and I think he's done great work. What we find, again, it just sort of challenge some of the things, because I find that, you talk to people about entrepreneurship in China in these areas, and everybody's, oh no, it's expanding. But when we actually look at what's happening from the production and activities of computers, components, and peripherals, what we find is that it's actually becoming more dependent upon the international community. It's not the domestic community that's producing these things, it's a wholly owned foreign enterprises. It stands for wholly owned foreign enterprise. When we look at the Chinese production in these areas, it's actually become a smaller percentage. Now, absolute numbers may go up, but what you're finding is lots of people are moving in, and they're actually the ones producing it. You know, it's one of the things as we start thinking about, even as we start looking about exports out of China. You know, I think it's an incredibly poor measure of what a society is doing. Why? Because whoever exports the last element out of a country gets the full credit for it. You know, when we look at China, what's really happening is that particularly in technology areas, we're finding these international companies are going in and they're assembling things. They're not even manufacturing. A lot of it's just assembly. China gets the full credit for whatever's shipped out, even though it's done for an American or a North American company, but China gets the full credit. And so exports are an incredibly poor measure of what a country's actually doing. And so what we find is that, you know, we talk about exports, but the truth is it's international companies that have gone in and they're assembling their products there. They're not even manufacturing the whole product. They're just assembling it, parts from all over the region. You know, exports from China, again, as we start thinking about it, it's foreign funded enterprises. Again, most of the exports are coming from foreign funded enterprises. You know, so as we sort of think about this, what we have to do, I think, is that when we talk about China today, there's a tendency to sort of say it's entrepreneurship. It's not entrepreneurship. It's a policy story. And when we start looking, I think generally when we think about China, there's a whole lot of misconceptions. And so, you know, I think as we think about China, there is a tendency to particularly in North America, to not understand China at a very deep level. You know, one of the things that we start thinking, and I think this is one of the reasons that's driving China to basically need to try to move up this value chain. You know, essentially China's cost advantage is disappearing, you know, if it hasn't already largely disappeared. China is no longer a low-cost manufacturing center. You know, particularly as we think about, and there's a great deal been written recently about reshoring. And so lots of companies are moving back to North America. Why? There's no reason to produce the product overseas anymore. It's just as cheap to produce it locally. You have a much more control over it. You don't have shipping. You don't have that lost time of shipping. And so all of those things are leading to reshoring of the activities. Particularly if we want the cost advantage relative to places like Mexico, it has already largely started to disappear. And so what you're finding is that Chinese manufacturing, again, wages have been going up 20% per year. And again, that when you start thinking about that, and you can't blame the government's trying to make sure that this issue of the spread of wealth, how do you make sure that you keep people at the bottom, get money to the people at the bottom? Well, we're going to increase wages. But it's like all things, there's unintended consequences. And one of those is, well, we're no longer cheap. We'll move inland. Well, firms aren't necessarily willing to move inland. And your cost advantage has necessarily disappeared. You know, the better solution, and it's the one the government, again, I don't think this is anything the government hasn't thought about. You know, we were talking at lunch, we had a great conversation. You know, the very top, you constantly hear entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship. But it's like moving the 50 levels below the very top is the difficult part. But the country is going to have to become much more entrepreneurial, much more creative, and start creating those products because its cost advantage is largely already disappeared. You know, when we look at China, look at relative to Mexico, it's basically at the same level today. Chinese share of manufacturing, again, is basically going to start decreasing for the United States, and you can, as we move forward, a lot of the productivity, while wages are going up in China, productivity has gone down. And again, it's a classic problem, and I don't think there's anything. Many of you are from China or very interested in China. But as you think about China, you know, and you start talking to people, what's one of the constant things they say? Well, the young people don't work like we used to. I mean, it's the nature of every increasing wealth society. People want a different life. But the factories in Guangdong province can no longer find all of the workers to fill up that they need. And they're having to offer them not only higher salaries, but they're having to offer them all these benefits, and they're just not doing the work that they did 10 years ago. It's not surprising, as people get wealthier, they want more. They're not willing to work the 12 hours and do the things. But what that means is you can't count on that low cost. You're going to have to start creating those new ventures. The new Googles are going to have to come from China if they're going to avoid the middle income trap. I think one of the things that's always a mistake when you talk about this, well, you'll have sometimes somebody say, well, China is an exceptional story. It's different than anywhere else in the world. I think that's an incredibly dangerous thing for China itself to view things that way. China is not any different than the rest of the world. China is not a unique place that somehow operates on a different level. And when we look at the percentage USD GDP, when we start, the time periods are different, but China has basically on the same path as the rest of Asia. Now the way that they got there is different, and this is the real key as we start thinking about what's going to happen in the future, and are they going to basically at the end of this path be able to match what Japan and South Korea did, and particularly with South Korea. When you look at what South Korea has been able to do, it's basically moved itself from this low-cost manufacturer to a creative center of innovation. It's an OECD country. How did it make that transition? And to me, that would be the critical issue that faces China, because yes, we have been on the same path as everybody else, but can we end up at the same places like Korea and others have been able to do? And so I think overall for China, the solution is basically going to have to be through entrepreneurship. It's going to have to be through creation. It's going to have to be creating those new products. But the caveat that I'd like to say that is that China itself has to also recognize that it's not on this path by itself. When we look at India, and one of the points I sort of, as we move on here, India, I think in some ways is better positioned ultimately for that creative process than China is. And so the path in the future is not necessarily an easy one, because when we look at India, it's basically on the same upward path. It started this process much later than China did. The reform process essentially didn't come to India until about 2000. And so they have been at it much, much slower. And so the per capita income's lower and other things. But India has some things in its advantage that China doesn't necessarily have. As we start thinking about this, one of these is the path that countries have chosen to move down this development. And right here, comparing it to Japan. But one of the problems facing China is that its development has been funded by FDI. They haven't developed internally these businesses. They have relied on flows of capital in. And so when we start thinking about where China would be relative to Japan, and I always think this story of two ratios is a great one. At a similar development period, a similar point in development, by this stage, Japan was already doing massive FDI outwards. China is still dependent upon FDI inwards. The FDI inwards was a great way to generate the economy up very quickly. But the danger is you don't develop these domestic, local companies that are strong competitors. When we compare that really to what China's done relative to Korea and Taiwan and Japan, China has chosen a very different development pattern. It's relied on this inward flow of capital that has come in. So when we start looking at India and China, and I'll probably skip some of these basic sort of facts about where India is, but today you can't deny it. China is the dominant partner in this relationship. China and India, China sells far more to India than India sells to China, et cetera, et cetera. It's clearly in the dominant position. The difficulty is for the future, because what you're finding is they're selling different things and they're relying on different activities. India is essentially selling to China knowledge management. It's selling technology ability. China is still basically selling cheap products. And so ultimately, where it's going to be successful in the future is you have to rely on those entrepreneurial creative processes. And that's one of the reasons why when you start thinking about what the prediction of the Goldman Sachs is that India is not going to have this high dramatic growth, but over time, India will outperform China because it's going to be based on knowledge. When you think about, again, we sort of talked about this a minute ago, when you think about the government in India doesn't work, and I don't know that anybody would argue that that's different. But what does that mean? Nobody looks to the government for anything. You look to be creative. You look to create businesses. You look to see, how can I be more innovative than the next guy? I'm not going to go to the government for anything. One of the risks that faces China is the government works and is a central power in the economy. One of the first points we talked about, what that means is you don't create anything without the government approval. But the very nature of governments is in some ways not to be entrepreneurial. Why? They want stability. They don't want innovation that disrupts a lot of things. They want stability. They want employment. All of the things that aren't necessarily associated with entrepreneurship. And if I have to go see a government bureaucrat to sort of get approval for things, what's he going to focus in on? Well, who are you and what's your relationships? And, I want to take the lowest risk policy, in many ways for a bureaucrat. What's the worst thing that can happen? It's not making no decision, it's making a bad decision. And so I will sit and I will do nothing rather than make a bad decision. And so when the government plays that central role, it ultimately confines that entrepreneurship. And so that's why you see Goldman Sachs has presented this pattern of development in the future. And this is growth per year, and so this doesn't mean that China's falling apart. It doesn't mean it's not going to grow, but it's not going to have those substantive high levels of growth. When you see those classic hockey sticks of going up through the ceiling, which will be what is needed to reach the OECD, you don't see that with China. Why? Because at some stage, it's not creating those entrepreneurial ventures that's going to happen. So, what do we end up with here over, one of the issues also to point out that I think is real critical for India, that ultimately India is also a younger country. This age issue for China is a central problem for the future. It's going to be more of a problem as we go forward, particularly for entrepreneurship. No offense to probably the vast majority of us here, but our two young colleagues here are probably much more likely to be entrepreneurs than the rest of us added together. We just don't take risk. At some age, you got to have young people taking risks. Risks are driven by young people. They're the ones who are sort of foolish enough not to realize they can't do something. They're the ones who are going to go off and try to do something that everybody else says is impossible. And again, think of Bill Gates, when he goes up and I'm going to take on IBM, you would have thought, you're crazy, would have been a real easy answer. What are you thinking? All of us would have probably, with a few more gray hairs, would have clearly been in that boat. But somebody who's young is, why not? So this is ultimately also a real issue for ultimately for China, is the age issue. It's just ultimately India's a lot younger. It's going to be much more aggressive. It's going to end up with a different cultural profile because of that growth. So one of the things is if we look at the pharmaceutical industry, I think you see this. China is much larger market, has larger export market. It's more FDI dominated. When we look at India, they're smaller firms, but what you find is they're more R&D oriented. They're creating new products. And so if we look at patents worldwide for pharmaceutical products, they're coming out of India, they're not coming out of China. China is essentially producing large commodity, very sort of simplistic sort of drugs, large volume based on cost. India, on the other hand, is trying to basically look to be R&D intensive, and they're looking to be worldwide competitive. You know, when we look at the size of the markets and the exports, again, China exports clearly far more than India does, but it's a different type of product they're exporting. Again, this low-cost type of product where India is looking at the high value added. You know, so what do we end up with? You know, today, even herbal medicines, China is losing out. You know, it's ultimately, there is a limit to what you can do as a low-cost provider, particularly as your costs go up. And that's one of the things, ultimately, again, I hope that particularly sitting in the U.S. and Canada that we appreciate is, you know, the need for everybody in China to participate in this economic growth that's happened in China. And so the government is thinking, how do we get more to other people? But the side effect is that it does raise your costs. And ultimately, when you're focused on being the low-cost provider in the world, it leaves you in a very tough position if you don't move up that value chain. And that value chain comes really from entrepreneurship. You know, so what we end up with, internationally approved drugs about 2 years ago, only 2 out of China. India had multiple ones. You know, if we look at 2 of their biggest firms, Raxabi, that's now, it was recently bought by a Japanese company, Shanghai Pharmaceutical Group, much larger for the Shanghai Pharmaceutical Group. But what you end up with is, again, when we think about the strategies, basically, the Indian firm was the one that was focusing on R&D products. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to think about, you know, as we sort of start trying to bring this to a close is, you know, clearly China has been successful. You know, the macroeconomics you can't deny. It's done amazing things, but it's a policy story. You know, it's a government that worked, they managed the economy well, and it's grown. But if you're going to avoid that middle income trap, that most countries never are able to progress out of the middle income up to the OECD, you've got to somehow start that entrepreneurship. You've got to start creating those products. You've got to make that switch that Korea and Japan both were able to do, where they basically used to produce low-cost products and instead they become identified with high-quality, high-price sorts of goods, high-differentiated products. And again, I'm probably older than most of you, but, you know, I can remember when I grew up, you know, what was the cheapest product you used to think of was Japanese. You know, you almost used to make jokes about cheap Japanese products. We would never make that joke today. Instead, we think of a Lexus. You know, we think of a Sony. You know, we think of, you know, all these great products that are not cheap, but they're high quality. Somehow China's going to have to make that same switch, and it's going to have to come through innovation that's going to be able to do it. And again, I find the government officials recognize this, but the difficulties actually being able to implement this policy, because it's going to take more than just official pronunciations. It's basically a shift in the culture. It's a shift in what the country's doing and how it's going to approach things. But the danger is, I think if they don't do it, they will get stuck in this middle income trap. You know, most countries are never able to progress out of moving to the middle income and then moving up to really that OECD level. The numbers of countries that have done it are relatively small over the last 50 years. You know, why? Because they're able to ultimately start to sell things, but they can't move into that innovation phase. And if they don't move into that innovation phase, then it will be problems. So really, what this, you know, I guess if this was a call, it's basically there needs to be more entrepreneurship. And there needs to be really, I hope students in China and I hope other people will really encourage entrepreneurship there. But that does mean that it takes on a risk-taking that to date I really don't see in China. I do see lots of small businesses, but I don't see it moving into that next level. So. And this is always a phrase I always like from Napoleon that basically says, you know, let China sleep, when she wakes she'll shake the world, but I really do think for it to shake the world, ultimately entrepreneurship has to be the driving factor. If it doesn't, I think China really faces the risk of reaching a level and stalling at that stage, which is the middle income trap. Doesn't mean things collapse, doesn't mean that things aren't good, but it doesn't move up to the level that is perceived. And so I think it's also important, particularly out of North America, to recognize, I think a lot of times people sort of see China taking over the world. You know, China has its own issues, you know, and one of them it's trying to face, and the change and really appreciating the change that's going to have to go on in China over this next 20 years is real significant. So, but I think we got about 30 minutes for questions or discussion. I'd be curious on what, I know we have the former ambassador. I know he's got great insights. And so if any of you have any questions or comments, I'd be very curious on what you have to say.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for a really excellent presentation on an important topic. I have long believed in what you're saying, not because of your writings, I didn't know about them, but I learned about them from an eminent Chinese whom I greatly respected for a long time, and that is Zhu Rongji, who was mayor of Shanghai when I was there, and a mayor of an entrepreneurial city who understood the importance of entrepreneurs in the private sector and did his best to promote it when he was in Shanghai. Then he became first vice premier and then premier. When he was vice premier, Deng Xiaoping was still alive, so there were limits to how much he could do, but the World Bank people, and I used to be with the World Bank also, told me that he was the senior Chinese who understood the market system the best and did his best to implement a true market system, but there was limits to how far he could go. When he became premier, he presided over bringing Hong Kong back to the motherland and admired many things that he found in Hong Kong. And he also brought China into the WTO. Not easy to do, not easy from a Chinese perspective. But in all these things, I greatly admired him, and he kept talking about the importance of the private sector. But he made many enemies. He was a sharply critical man. He was completely honest, and it's difficult to work in the Chinese system when you're completely honest. You make many enemies. He criticized many people. He was only allowed to stay for one term. Normally you get 2 terms in China because he was so outspoken. And since he's retired, he is not under house arrest, but he's almost a non-person. But he's written a book in Chinese, maybe it's not in an English translation, saying many of the things you're saying, the importance of promoting the private sector and entrepreneurs in China. So I'm really delighted to hear you saying these things, because I know there are people like Zhu Rongji who believe it's very important for the future of China.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean, I'd be curious, because you've got a great insight on China. I mean, do you think it's going to be able to make that shift? Because it seems like it's clear that they've got to make the shift, but it really, it's going to be difficult, and you're challenging a lot of sort of almost embedded systems that don't necessarily fit with it. Do you think they're going to make the transition?
I'm frankly not sure. I mean, it's important to remember that Zhu Rongji was really not a senior party man. He was promoted because he was such a brilliant brilliant administrator and somebody who was a technocrat who knew how the economy worked. But it's the party that decides these things. And the party really now, so many people in the party have a vested interest in the big state-owned enterprises. You know, everyone that I can think of has key links to the existing system. So frankly, I don't see it changing in the near future. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see it change. But we're still waiting to see what Xi Jinping really stands for. The reason he's become the leader is because he hasn't put a foot wrong. He hasn't disturbed any of the main elements in the party, but we won't know what he stands for another year or two after he's consolidated his hold and put people in all the right places. He has had some exposure to the United States. He stayed here. Maybe he will change things, but I'm still a little gloomy.
Yeah, it's always seems like that's the difficult part, because even if you have the top guy, you know, he's got lots of authority, you got these 50 layers or 100 layers underneath him in all the different places, and they have such vested interests.
Absolutely. And they have Hong Kong now. Hong Kong still has a lot of autonomy. If they just looked at Hong Kong, all the lessons they can learn from Hong Kong, but instead they see that Hong Kong is not a way for the party to move forward. It troubles them because Hong Kong people are not plugged to the party.
Right. If anything, it's become less so, it seems, over, I don't know what Rosalie did, it seems like in the last 5 years, I know they had the problem with education. It's very interesting. I appreciate your comments. Really great history there. Anything else? Anybody want to say anything? We got a small group, but you're powerful, okay? Yeah, Rosa.
Okay, in the Goldman Sachs charts where you compare the projected growth rates between India and China, that's before the current economic problems that India has. I mean, India is very much in the news in the past couple of weeks about the problems they have. You know, the economy is almost in a free fall, the rupee too. So how do you?
I think that's absolutely right. And I was in India in March. I think India has some of the same challenges that China does, in that they have some very vested interest and they've been pushing back against a lot of the economic reforms. I think for this to really hold out, and so I'm probably less concerned about this year's, currency sorts of problems than I think, my personal bias is that ultimately for entrepreneurship and really for this pattern to hold, India is going to have to go forward with some further deregulations and opening of markets. But again, that challenges the vested interest because all of a sudden, what's the reality of deregulation? People go out of business that aren't that efficient. But that's where what spawns entrepreneurship is all of a sudden you're willing to say, okay, the newer and the better comes about. And I found, it was interesting, I talked to a couple people at the embassy and American Embassy, I apologize. Obviously that was the embassy I was talking to, although there were also visited some people at the French embassy casually. And what you found is they were sort of discouraged that what had really looked like openings and trying to get businesses to do certain things, that there had been such pushback that they weren't willing to do. And so I think you're absolutely right. You got to take this with a grain of salt. And predicting very far out to 2040, is very problematic. But I do think if India doesn't open up its market, that it can have ultimate problems. Because ultimately I think that's really the more integrated. If I had a bias on everything that I do, is that the more integrated countries become, the better off they are. It produces more innovation because it just creates more pressures to innovate, and those are good things. And that's really where innovation comes from, is when you have these pressures to innovate. So I think you do have to take something like this with a grain of salt. What I find interesting, as long as sort of the same lines, what are we talking about now is it's not the BRIC countries. It's really that sort of the old stable countries have come back. And all of a sudden, the United States and Canada and some of these countries that everybody sort of thought, well, you're a nice place to retire, all of a sudden look like they're the economic engines for the world. And in some ways, I think that it's in Brazil, you could say the same about Brazil and some other places that are in the BRIC countries. And I think it's pushing them all to be more innovative. And I think that's, if anything, some of those things that people thought were sort of had reached passé, that, free economies with lots of entrepreneurship, who needs them? I think it's coming back to be true, and I hope that it pushes India and China and some of these other countries to really sort of, again, move back to sort of that liberalization of their economies. And it is a tough process. I mean, as the ambassador mentioned, there's lots of invested interests that are going to be, they get pushed around, but ultimately for the people, it's the best process. Because, again, and I say this as an entrepreneurship person, but ultimately it's the innovation. It's a natural process. Old ones go away and new ones are created, and it's not always a nice process to live through, but ultimately, if you look over the span of history, that's really where creativity comes from. That's where new products and new ideas, and that's ultimately where people benefit. So I think Rosalie's absolutely right. Please take this with a grain of salt. Looking very far out, and India clearly has its own sort of issues. real honestly, you know, some of the reason I put the India thing in, I think, so I've made this presentation in China before, and I think it's always critical that, particularly internally to China, that you know, particularly the students realize, okay, it's awfully easy to sort of, that phrase, drink the Kool-Aid, sort of believe everything's perfect and going on the right path, and to realize, well, you have competitors too, and they're looking to get exactly where you are. And I think their vision so many times on the United States or the UK or some developed economy, but they also have to realize they're competing against lots of other emerging economies that essentially want the same things that they do. So their firms are, I think, are increasingly going to face a lot of pressure as they move up those paths. Yes, sir.
I think what you have presented is a lot of truth in that, and I think the Chinese leadership are fully aware of that. You look at the 12 five-year plan, the investment and the emphasis on green and renewable sustainability, they are there. It's also quite true that under Hu Jiantao, state-owned enterprises have grown compared with the private sector. But I think if you look at the overall characteristics of Chinese entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, in Wenzhou, in Singapore, in Taiwan, Indonesia, the Chinese entrepreneurs recognizes the constraints within China, and they've moved against great odds to succeed. An entrepreneur in Wenzhou has to finance a business at interest rate that is 20–30% per annum, and they survive. So I think your point is very well taken, that if the government, with its current policy success in bringing Chinese average living standard up to a certain level, has succeeded. But I think they also recognize very much what you have pointed out, that success has its ceiling. And I just came back from China yesterday. The difference between China and Japan and Korea are fundamentally that China is trying to follow the path of the United States with a big domestic market. It has recognized that it cannot export to the degree that Korea and Japan can to sustain prosperity and to promote innovation. It has to follow the path of the United States to create a much bigger domestic market, and using that as a mechanism to finance its future growth and for its average citizen to be able to have to get out of the middle income trap. I think that the people that I have encountered are recognizing many of these issues. What they have seen is that they are not quite at the stage where Japan was in the 80s. They believe that they are more like the United States in the 30s and 40s. And the domestic market still needs to grow, and they need to build infrastructure to allow it to happen. So we also operate in India, and we're finding in India is very much like what you said. India is focused on knowledge-based economy because it really cannot do otherwise. You cannot, 1993 when I went to Shanghai with our provincial premier, we cannot schedule more than one meeting a day because you cannot get to a second meeting. Mumbai is in that stage. You really have no idea when you can get from one place to the next. We build a factory, well, you cannot get material in and you cannot get material out. So India needs to go through a certain stage that China should go through. Massive investment in infrastructure, which government can never do, have enough resources. So in China, now they change it, but a few years back before they had automated the toll, you go from Guangzhou to Shantou, your arm gets tired paying tolls. Okay? Every highway is tolled. India needs to do something similar. So I think that a lot of your analysis are very correct. Would China be able to get out of that trap is very much now in the hands of this generation of leaders. So the mayors that we are seeing.
And that's what you hope. You do talk to people, and at the very top, it seems like they understand that we're at a cusp and we really got to move. You know, where I get concerned with China is sometimes you talk to people that are lower in the organization, or you go to, and I find professors are very aware of it. But then you start moving out into other places, and it's almost like, well, no, you just, if they don't have sort of that worldwide vision, they don't really realize at really almost what a critical point in history they are. You know, because I do find the people at the top are very aware, we've got to get to this point, we've got to move, it's time to sort of tip over the balance this way. But then you start moving down the organization and you start talking to people and they're just like, well, you know, things are good. And life for them is good, but that change issue. And so I think you're absolutely right, you know, and whether it'll change over this next 10 years is going to be interesting. You really hope, you know, I'm hopeful because ultimately, you know, my personal bias is too, that the more the Chinese economy grows, it's better for everybody, you know, and you want, the more they're integrated with the world, you know, that's how you generate less arguments. You know, why do the United States and Russia, I don't think they get along, is they don't do business with each other. You ultimately get so connected with each other, and the more you integrate, ultimately you can't get too, forgive my French, but you can't get too pissed off at anybody. Why? Because we got too much interest, we got too many connections, we got too much stuff going on.
And the relationship between China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
And that's why I always said that let's don't worry about China ever invading Taiwan. But, you know, Beijing is basically saying that in order to grow the Chinese economy, they need more Taiwanese managers. For Taiwan to continue to survive, they need more investment into China to support their growth. The two are so tied together, all those missiles, whatever, will never be fired. If they're fired, they go into the sea, not into the island. But I think in terms of China, it is a very peculiar society. China is living simultaneously over a span of 2,000 years. Shanghai, Hangzhou, Beijing, they're ready to move on. But then you move into Qinghai, you move into Ningxia, well, they are still living 2,000 years ago. 4.5 hours out of Beijing, you're going to Shanxi province. I went and visited the coal mine city of Yang, I forgot the name now. It's only 4.5 hours away. People are living in caves. So can you imagine? 4.5 hours from Beijing, people still living in caves. And I only got to see them because the highway was closed for maintenance. And the car was being diverted into the national roads, which are really going through all the little villages. So I asked somebody right at the bridge when we stopped, I said, well, why do you live here? I said, how much do you make? And he told me 1 RMB a day. And I said, well, why do you stay here? And he said, where else can I go? And then I met with the mayor of the city. They are venting 500,000 cubic meters of methane into the air, atmosphere. 500,000 cubic meters. We talk about greenhouse gases and whatever. Methane is 32 times more potent than carbon dioxide. They produce 20 million tons a year of coal, and 500,000 cubic meters of methane is going into the air. I said, this is free energy. Why don't you use it to create some economic value? They want to generate power. The state grid would not permit them to integrate in the grid. I said, you're 4.5 hours away. Why don't you have greenhouses to grow vegetables for Beijing? And he said, I don't know how. So I think, Professor, China is facing this issue of living simultaneously a span of 2,000 years, and government policy in Beijing somehow need to deal with those people who are still living 2,000 years ago and need to bring them up to closer to a modern state, while the rest of Shanghai and others are racing away And this is a phenomenon that we're seeing in Vancouver. All the entrepreneurs who want more success are immigrating to North America. And that becomes another issue where we are doing a study between Canada and China. How can China change its policy to retain the best of the entrepreneurs if they want to grow the economy?
Yeah, I do think that's critical. It's interesting examples, though. I love that.
Yeah, I just had a couple of points. I recall reading that China's expenditure on R&D is actually the highest in the world. I don't know if that's correct or...
What typically it's not in absolute dollars, but it's in purchasing power. And so they do that. And the difficulty, the numbers that I had are really looking just at indigenization. But you also have to be real careful interpreting R&D numbers from China, because it tends to be in purchasing power, and they tend to lump a lot of things into it. It's not really basic. It tends to be very applied types of R&D. And so I've seen a lot of those numbers, but I write on technology. And so just as a general caveat, you want to be a little careful interpreting, but they do spend a lot. But again, I think that's part of the government's recognition that they want to move that direction.
The only other point is, I also recall reading that they have increased their focus on innovation.
Right.
So much so that they've actually been recruiting abroad from all different fields. I don't know how successful that program has been, but they have emphasized the need, and they realize the need for innovation, which will spawn the entrepreneurship.
And I think it's very consistent with what the government has recognized it, done it now. Now, I've never seen anybody do a study how powerful it is, but particularly, Suzhou and Hangzhou, you'll meet a lot of these guys that have come back and have been successful. A lot of times, and some of them, particularly in Suzhou, are really world-class competitors, very, very innovative sorts of things that have come back, and the government has made it easy. Part of the difficulty, I think, for China, again, is it's such a big country. You can get 1,000 people or even 10,000, innovative people, and it's difficult to really move that needle very far. But the government, again, that's part of the government policy, and a number of them have come back. I've met with a number of them in Suzhou and Hangzhou, and very innovative guys that are doing interesting things. I do find most of them are not, while there are some cutting-edge technologies, an awful lot of it is also reinterpreting something for the Chinese market and doing that, or many times they're also focused on a low-cost approach, which you can clearly come to China and you can hire the personnel, and they've got the skills and the supports, but it's not always, it's not that a lot of times the real cutting-edge sort of, rethinking the entire way that we do.
So your fear is that the impact of any of that is not going to be sufficient for...
Well, I think it's a great program. I'm not going to criticize, but I don't know that it's moved the needle really.
Right.
And I think it's the government. I don't know. You may be much more familiar with the program than I am.
I think the reason for that is very simple, is that the Chinese market is so big.
Yeah.
You don't need to have cutting-edge technology.
Yeah.
What you need is you go and look at around the world and say, what can I copy? Okay? Now, not only just for export, but just domestic market. Mm-hmm. And so for us in Canada, I always said, well, you look at China, what is the biggest opportunity for Canada? Food is the biggest opportunity. You don't need to go into anything fancy. You just go into food. Water. Okay. So we are in clean technology. Well, where do I find market in Canada? Well, it's tough for me to find a place that needs clean technology. But in China, the moment you land, you're standing on contaminated soil, you're breathing contaminated air, you drink contaminated water. You don't need to look. Okay. The market's everywhere. So to that degree, why I equate China to the United States in the 1930s and 40s. Okay. That was an apple at that time for the United States. Germany was the leading edge innovators. UK were the leading edge innovators. United States start to be able to use those technology, enhance the domestic market, and to create economic strength for it to now build into the next stage. So this is why I don't think China would be into cutting-edge technology for at least another 10 years. Because there's no need. Okay? If I'm there to make money, why do I need to go into cutting-edge technology when I can just harness somebody else's technology and go after 1.3 billion people market? Forget about 1.3 billion. Only the 300 million middle class is more than enough for me to make lots of money. So I think it's a professor from that perspective, as somebody who makes money. Entrepreneurs are driven by two things. One is money, but more importantly, passion. So we took risks to go become entrepreneur because we believe in something. Okay? And so for me to go back to China to help China clean up their water or help them to change the agriculture production in China is 200 times that of Canada. So the minister asked me, why do I come back to Canada? I said, why do I want to come back to Canada? Okay. I get 1% of the market in China that equal to double the whole of Canadian production. So that is what is driving the economy away from cutting-edge innovation, because you don't need cutting-edge innovation. Now, for me to do sustainable aquaculture in China, you need cutting-edge innovation. But that's only because of my passion. I want sustainable production. But if I don't care about sustainability, I can produce and make lots of money in China with just a little bit of edge over the domestic market. So, Professor, that is part of the reason why, when I mentioned that China living simultaneously over a span of 2,000 years, is that the opportunity to make money in China is so easy that you don't really need technology at this point of time. But could the domestic growth offset the declining export? Can China copy the United States and create an economy and generate wealth domestically to offset what has been relying on in export, which Korea and Japan still rely on? So those are the differences in terms of the economic model moving forward.
There's a good book called The Run of the Red Queen, and it's an author at Georgia Tech, and he makes a lot of those same arguments. And again, I probably fall into sort of a little different thinking. They need to be moving to cutting edge, but he gets the title because Alice in Wonderland ultimately finds the White Queen or whoever she's looking for by looking backwards, not by looking forwards. And so the goal is that China doesn't necessarily need to be looking for exports and growing a lot of technology. Again, I probably fall into a little different camp, but it's a great point. There's a lot of, and I think it's a real valid view of the world.
But that's really the policy-driven thing too.
Yeah.
For now, Beijing has decided export is not the future. That's why they're raising minimum wage by 15-20% a year. They're fully aware that will kill off the low-value exports. But they are saying that now, policy-wise, they have made a determination, growing domestic market, growing domestic demand is their future. And they're giving up on low-value exports. And then in China, they also have what we have called GST. They call value-added tax. And the rebate of the VAT is completely structured towards high-value products. They don't want low-value export anymore. So if you go in as a high-energy intensive, low-value product, you don't get any rebate. Okay. You still pay the VAT for all your materials, but export would not get any rebate. But if you are into a high-tech product with low energy consumption, you get an extraordinary VAT rebate. So China actually is playing that game of trying to use free market to mobilize the whole business sector towards that part of the economy. But it does not change the fact that the Chinese economy is going to be so big domestically that you can get rich without having to focus on export. But again, this is going to be a huge policy-driven, and you're 100% right. China is a policy story. And entrepreneurs are just a player within that policy environment.
Anything else? We haven't heard from our two colleagues here. You guys have been very quiet.
I just have a question about
Okay.
how do you think about the billionaire Li Jiacheng, the Victor Lee in Hong Kong, and he considering to access Hong Kong to European countries. Is it anything related to?
I'm not sure I follow, so what's happening in Hong Kong?
Is,
She's asking about Victor Lee.
Yeah,
Lee,
Victor Lee.
the son of Li Ka-shing,
Right?
exiting Hong Kong to Europe.
no,
Oh,
yes.
I didn't realize that.
Some kind of a rumor, but I'm pretty sure. I think this is the
Boy.
thing.
Rosalie would probably know far more than.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that would be
something-
huge. That would be. I would assume it would disturb Hong Kong infinitely.
Well, I think in many ways though, today none of us are tied to any one location anymore. It's where we put our investment. Whether Victor Lee lives one place or the other. No, actually, he has still an apartment right at beachfront here.
Oh yeah.
He lived in Vancouver. Okay. So and his cousin was my classmate in McGill. So I think today Hong Kong has become an international financial center.
Yeah.
It has learned how to capture China's benefit and became one of the largest IPO centers in the world, mostly to recycle the Chinese money, just like British Virgin Island.
Yeah.
Hong Kong is easier than BVI. It's just go to Hong Kong, you go back, now you consider foreign investment. So Hong Kong has been extremely entrepreneurial in understanding how it can generate wealth for itself. But I always said, Hong Kong's existence is completely because of the emergence of the communists in China. If communism did not come to China, there would not have been Hong Kong. So all the entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, my classmates when I grew up in Hong Kong, most of them could not speak Cantonese. They came from Ningbo, they came from Shanghai, they came to... so all these things are happening in Hong Kong. China's using Hong Kong as a window for the future. Every major city in China wants to be Hong Kong.
Well, I clearly love Hong Kong. It's a wonderful city, and I think if he's leaving, and he probably has homes, dozen homes. I just think psychologically it would be a huge impact for if he said he was leaving, just because they're sort of like one of the first families of Hong Kong. I can't imagine that they would. He may not ever spend any time there, but I can't imagine that he would leave in a huff. But hopefully not.
But
It's a
Vic has
wonderful
been
city.
serving Canadian past for a long time.
Yeah.
He's Canadian.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a broad question, and it's probably not a fair question. But I mean, there are many mitigating factors, right? It's a very complex story. Domestic economy rises, and there's possible inflationary pressures. There's the value of renminbi against the American dollar. There's the buy-in to American debt, right, which is around 16 trillion. It's about 30% of that is owned in Asia. So and then of course 3-digit oil prices that show no sign of going anywhere. And of course, the higher oil prices go, the tougher it is to grow economies. You've got to somehow fuel your economy. So with all that to one side, the unfair question is, for someone who's not an expert in this area, can you extrapolate out from present circumstances in terms of the culture, the bureaucratic culture in China, and the constraints it places on entrepreneurial behavior? Can you kind of extrapolate out a few years in terms of, if the current status quo is maintained, what are the specific kind of pressures that will be brought to bear on Chinese leadership to change their course? You say it's enculturated, it's deeply, it's part of the culture, right? Great pressure needs to be born to change that culture. What do those pressures look like in 10 years, 15 years? What are they going to have to react to?
Well, again, it's predicting
Yeah, I know,
future.
it's-
It's very, very difficult. I do think China's at a critical point, and I probably do think they need. And in some ways, I think and I I absolutely agree. It's very easy for entrepreneurs. So they're just looking at capturing sort of the low-hanging fruit in China. I think one of the dangers for China is if that becomes the model, it's really hard to move up that value chain. It's really hard. At some stage, China has to start creating the Googles and the Microsofts, and because you want to have those engines that employ and spin off thousands of other firms that are paying, ridiculously high salaries, and because those benefits float through an entire society. China's always going to, I think, foreseeable future, always going to have positive growth. It just gets very difficult to maintain the growth at the level you really want to move to the OECD.
I guess I'm thinking, what does that ceiling look like, and what kind of pressures?
I do think the pressures between the rich and the poor are very significant in China. I think everybody's sort of thought for a long period of time, because I'm real interested in the issues of poverty, and I think everybody used to think China, you've got to give China credit. 600 million people moved out of poverty. And it was the biggest shift in the poor in the world. And really, if we look at the change in poverty rates around the world at 250 a day, really the only change has been that China has moved those people out. I think the thought used to be that those 300 million would eventually sort of rise up with the rising tide. But the truth is, it hasn't worked that way. They're sort of still cemented in this bottom, and the rest of the world is moving up, and it gets a little bit to the point of we've got a spread of 2,000, but this 300 million, it's a huge population, and I think that's it's always a risk, is how do you ultimately pull that group up? And I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to do, because the world is moving to a much more technological, it's moving to a much more aggressive, and some of the danger for China too, and while you can argue, well, that's not reality, but the government was essentially founded on sort of equality, and we're working for the working people, and we're there for the poor. Some of the difficulty for the United States is, that's not our philosophy. I mean, no matter what, fundamentally, if I had to summarize the United States sort of underlying assumption is, you work hard to get an even deal. If you make it, you get to keep it. If you don't, life is what it is. And so we don't get as upset about poverty in the United States, but I think China has an underlying philosophy that we were founded to help the average person. We were founded to help the poor and the working man. And if you end up with 25% of your population that's really left behind and gets further left and left behind further and further, it's probably more difficult for China to deal with than it will be a place like the United States. And so I do think China is facing some real issues in how do you deal with this population that's fundamentally left. And I don't know what the solution is, real honestly, because in some ways, I think ultimately, the more you encourage entrepreneurship, the more you sort of push things forward. And you keep the state, the role is the same. I don't see it closing that gap, and if anything, it becomes more accentuated. And so, if I had a caveat for
it's an impossible task. I don't think anybody has the answer, because I think this is maybe professors like you would be able to do some more research. But I think it's against in human history. I don't think we have seen a situation where you have 1 billion people with that disconnected, of such a large space. United States is 340 million people, but in 1930s and 40s it was probably 100 million, and yet it's 10 times that size. So China has the time to make that jump is a big issue. It's not that it cannot, but the people who are now in Shanghai and in Beijing and Guangzhou are becoming impatient. They say, why do I need to wait? I'm ready to go. And yet the people living in caves are saying, well, what's my turn? I'm still lining up. How can you move away? And so the pressure on China is that how do you maintain stability? When there's people saying, I can see my cousins on the coast are making bundles. Okay? What about me? Okay? And yet the cousins and on the coast are saying that, why am I being dragged behind by these poor cousins? And so if you don't change enough, then I'm going to go away. And so the pressure point for China is losing all the most talented people to overseas because they can afford to. They don't need the government. And yet the government needs them to bring the poor cousins out. So it's a tremendous dilemma. So I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, and I think that's always the issue with big problems is there's no clear answer for it. But I think everybody would say if you had to pick one huge issue facing China, it's going to be it. So, thank you guys very, very much. I do have some business cards up here if you have
And thank you, Professor Bruton, for an excellent talk. I learned a heck of a lot. Of course, I have more questions now than when I came in.
Well, that's good. That's what you want. That's what you want.
Yeah, and many thanks to Professor Rosalie Tong for once again bringing in an excellent speaker to our forum. And of course, for those of you who have friends, I know there were some people who actually registered at the last minute were not able to attend. So if you let friends know that we archive these presentations on the David Lamb Center website. Pacific Region Forum has been archiving these for many years, so they're welcome to go and listen to the talk again. And we do have a small party gift, just as a token of thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It's light, it'll fit in your suitcase.
Oh, that's exactly what I need. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, gentlemen.